When the ocean holds its breath, even the bravest sailors listen. The Starbreaker was a cargo ship with a storied history. Built in the 1960s, it had braved decades of treacherous seas, carrying goods across the world. But over the years, rumors began to swirl about strange occurrences aboard the vessel. Whispers in empty corridors, footsteps where no one walked, and shadows that didn't belong to any crew member. To be why the time Alan joined the crew, the Starbreaker was on its final voyage, bound for decommissioning in a shipyard far from home. A skeleton crew had been assigned to see the ship through its last journey, and Alan, fresh out of the Navy, was eager for the experience. He wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. The first few days were uneventful. The crew of 8 settled into their routines, keeping the ship on course. But as they entered the open ocean, far from any land, the atmosphere aboard the Starbreaker began to change. That it started with small things. Alan would hear faint tapping sounds coming from the walls of his cabin late at night. At first, he chalked it up to the ship's aging structure. But when the tapping began to form a rhythm, a deliberate, repetitive pattern, he couldn't ignore it. "You hear that?" he asked Karen, the ship's engineer, over breakfast one morning. That Karen's eyes flicked up from her coffee. "The tapping? Yeah, it's the pipes, probably. Doesn't sound like pipes to me," Alan muttered. Karen didn't reply. She seemed more focused on stirring her coffee than meeting his gaze. The next night, Alan's suspicions deepened. While making his rounds, he passed the engine room and thought he saw someone standing in the shadows. When he called out, the figure vanished. He searched the room, but it was empty. Later, as he climbed the stairs to the bridge, he heard the faint sound of a woman humming. The melody was haunting, unfamiliar, and seemed to echo through the ship. But no one else reported hearing it. 3 nights before their arrival at the shipyard, the Starbreaker was caught in a sudden and violent storm. The crew worked tirelessly to keep the ship steady, battling the roaring waves and howling winds. Amid the chaos, Alan's radio crackled to life. "Alan, below deck," a voice whispered, faint but unmistakable. That he grabbed the radio. "Who is this?" The reply was garbled, drowned out by static and the storm. But one word came through clearly: help. Against his better judgment, Alan descended below deck, the flashlight in his hand barely cutting through the darkness. The storm's fury seemed muted down here, replaced by an eerie stillness. He followed the sound of faint sobbing, his footsteps echoing in the narrow corridors. The sobbing led him to the ship's cargo hold. When he entered, he was hit by an intense cold that made his breath visible in the air. His flashlight beams swept across the hold, landing on a woman standing near the far wall. She wore an old-fashioned dress, soaked as if she'd just stepped out of the ocean, and her hair clung to her pale face. "Who are you?" Alan asked, his voice shaking. The woman raised a hand, pointing toward a crate in the corner. "They never left," she whispered before dissolving into mist. That Alan's heart pounded as he approached the crate. With trembling hands, he pried it open to reveal a pile of rotting wood and a tattered ship's log. The entries described a mutiny decades earlier. Crew members who had turned on their captain and cast him and his family overboard. The ship's log ended abruptly with a final, chilling note: "They'll never forgive us." When Alan returned to the bridge, his crewmates were waiting for him, their faces pale. "Did you see her?" Karen asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alan nodded. "Who was she?" Karen exchanged a glance with the others. "The captain's wife. She's been haunting this ship for years." As the Starbreaker limped into the shipyard the next morning, the storm finally abating, Alan couldn't shake the feeling that they'd escaped by the narrowest of margins. He left the ship with the logbook in hand, vowing to uncover the full truth. The Starbreaker was dismantled, its pieces scattered across the globe. But sailors say her spirit lingers, whispering through the waves, warning those who dare to forget her story. Would you have followed the voice in the storm? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales that will make you think twice about the sea. Until next time, stay safe on the water. Not all who patrol the decks are among the living. The HMS Artemis had been decommissioned for years, its rusted hull tethered to a forgotten pier at the edge of the harbor. Once a proud warship, it was now a relic of history, visited only by enthusiasts and the occasional trespassing thrill seeker. To Henry, a security guard assigned to patrol the ship. It was just another job. He'd taken the night shift reluctantly, lured by the promise of double pay. The ship's eerie reputation didn't bother him. Stories of ghostly footsteps and disembodied voices were just that, stories. And besides, he'd spent years working in empty buildings. The Artemis was no different, or so he thought. That Henry's first few nights aboard the Artemis were uneventful. He made his rounds with a flashlight, checking the cavernous engine room, the shadowy mess hall, and the cramped sleeping quarters. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of metal as the ship settled. It was on his fourth night that things began to change. While patrolling the lower deck, Henry heard the unmistakable sound of boots on metal. They were heavy and deliberate, echoing through the empty corridors. He froze, his flashlight beam darting across the walls. "Hello," he called, his voice bouncing back to him. No reply. Shaking his head, he chalked it up to his imagination and continued his rounds. But as he ascended the stairs to the bridge, he caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. A shadow, humanoid in shape, disappeared into the darkness of the navigation room. That Henry's heart pounded. He wasn't alone. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences intensified. Tools he'd seen neatly arranged in the engine room were found scattered across the floor. Doors he'd locked at the start of his shift were inexplicably open. And always, there was the sound of footsteps, pacing the decks as if someone were on patrol. One night, while reviewing security footage in the control room, Henry saw it, a figure in a Navy uniform, its features obscured, walking the length of the deck. The figure stopped, turned toward the camera, and then vanished. Henry rewound the tape, his hands trembling. The figure appeared again, repeating the same sequence of movements, before dissolving into thin air. Determined to confront whatever was haunting the ship, Henry brought a digital recorder with him on his next shift. He set it up in the navigation room, where he'd seen the shadow. As he patrolled the ship, the air grew colder, and the familiar sound of footsteps returned. This time, they were closer. Henry turned sharply, his flashlight cutting through the dark. Standing at the end of the corridor was the figure he'd seen on the tape. Its uniform was immaculate, but its face was a pale blur, as though the features had been erased. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward the bridge. "Who are you?" Henry demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and began walking, its boots clanging against the metal floor. Henry followed, his flashlight beam steady despite his trembling hands. The figure led him to the captain's quarters, where it stopped and turned to face him. For a moment, the air was deathly still. Then, in a voice that sounded like the rustle of leaves, it spoke. He never left. The door to the captain's quarters creaked open on its own. Inside, Henry found a logbook lying open on the desk. The pages were yellowed with age, but the ink was fresh. The last entry read, "Mutiny on board. The crew has turned against me. If anyone finds this, know that I did my duty to the END.AS." Henry read the entry. The room grew unbearably cold. He turned to find the figure standing inches away, its eyeless face fixed on him. Before he could react, the figure dissolved, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence. Henry resigned the next day, unable to shake the memory of the ghostly watchman. He later learned that the Artemis's captain had died during a mutiny. His body never recovered. Some said his spirit remained aboard, forever patrolling the decks in search of justice. The ship was eventually sold for scrap, but workers reported strange happenings during its dismantling. Tools disappearing, lights flickering, and the faint sound of boots echoing through the empty hull. The HMS Artemis may be gone, but those who worked on her will never forget the phantom watchman who refused to abandon his post. Would you have followed the ghostly figure? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the sea that will keep you up at night. Until next time, remember, some posts are never truly abandoned.
The ocean hides more than treasures beneath its waves. The Queen's Emissary was the jewel of the fleet, a luxurious passenger liner famous for its opulent interiors and smooth voyages. But to the crew, it was known for something else, the strange song that could sometimes be heard late at night, rising softly from the ocean below. Among those who worked the ship was Elena, a deckhand who had grown up hearing tales of sirens. Her grandmother's stories of beautiful, otherworldly creatures that lured sailors to their doom had always seemed like fairy tales. But on her third voyage aboard the Queen's emissary, Elena began to reconsider. The first time she heard the song, she was scrubbing the deck under a moonlit sky. The water was calm, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Then, faintly at first, came a melody. It was hauntingly beautiful, a woman's voice singing a wordless tune that seemed to echo through her very soul. Elena paused, her brush frozen in mid-scrub. She looked over the railing, her heart racing. There was nothing but the vast, empty ocean. Did you hear that? Elena asked Liam, the night shift lookout. As she handed over her tools, Liam raised an eyebrow. Hear what? The singing, she said. Out on the water. Liam's face darkened. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. You mean the siren song? Elena laughed nervously. You're joking, right? But Liam didn't smile. They say it's why the ship's been cursed. Every few voyages, someone hears it. And when they do, well, bad things happen. Like what? Elena asked. Liam hesitated, then shook his head. Just stay away from the water at night. The warning stayed with her. Over the next few nights, Elena avoided the deck during her shift, keeping her head down and her thoughts focused on her tasks. But the song returned, louder and more persistent. It followed her in her dreams, its melody echoing in her mind even as she woke. Then, one night, she saw it. While closing the hatch to the cargo hold, Elena glanced over the railing and froze. A figure floated just below the surface, illuminated by the moonlight. It was a woman, her long hair billowing in the water like seaweed, her eyes glowing faintly. She was beautiful and terrifying all at once. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came. Then, without warning, she reached out, her hand breaking the surface of the water. Elena, the voice whispered, though the woman's mouth did not move. Come closer. Elena stumbled backward, her heart pounding. The woman's gaze held her, pulling at something deep within. For a moment, she felt her body move toward the railing, as though compelled by an unseen force. But the sound of footsteps broke the spell. Elena. Liam's voice cut through the air. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back from the railing. What are you doing? She blinked, the figure in the water gone. She was there, Elena said, her voice trembling. The siren. Liam's grip tightened. You're coming with me. Now. Liam led Elena to the captain's quarters, where they told Captain Morrow what had happened. The captain listened grimly, his fingers steepled under his chin. You're not the first to see her, he said. She's been haunting this ship for years. We believe she's tied to the ship's bell. The bell? Elena repeated, confused. It was recovered from a wreck decades ago, Morrow explained. A merchant vessel that disappeared without a trace. The only thing salvaged was the bell. It said to summon the siren when rung after midnight. Elena's stomach churned. Why keep it on board? Superstition, Morrow said. But now, I think it's time to let it go. The captain ordered the bell removed from its mount on the bridge. As the clock struck midnight, the crew gathered on deck. With great effort, they hoisted the bell over the railing and dropped it into the sea. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the water churned violently, as though the ocean itself were enraged. A piercing wail echoed through the air, sending shivers down their spines. The waves surged, rocking the ship, but as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The sea grew calm, and the siren's song was no more. Elena never saw the siren again, but the memory lingered, a reminder of how close she'd come to being lost to the sea. The Queen's emissary completed its voyage without further incident, and the crew quietly agreed never to speak of the bell. Years later, Elena's granddaughter asked her why she'd left the sea. Elena smiled faintly and replied, sometimes, the ocean keeps secrets we're not meant to uncover. And somewhere, in the depths of the ocean, the siren waits, her song silenced but her presence eternal. What would you have done if you heard the siren's song? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more haunting tales from the deep. Until next time, beware the call of the sea.